Hey there, it's Mark with Mark's Astro Journey. Today I just wanted to share with you 15 time saving tips if you're fairly new to astrophotography. If you're already a seasoned expert, then you probably don't even need a video like this. But if you're looking for ways to save time in your imaging sessions, keep watching because in this video I'm going to talk about 15 tips for saving time during your imaging sessions. So let's get started. So I made my list, and one of the things that you can do, it may sound obvious, but set up your equipment before dark if possible. If you're someone who doesn't have a permanent setup, where you have a pier or an observatory, and you're carrying your equipment out each time you do an imaging session, I know sometimes we can't avoid it, but when you set up in the dark, you've got your headlamp on, and you're likely to stumble, drop something, not connect something right, and you're just kind of fumbling around in the dark. And if there's any way you can buy out 20 to 30 minutes to set up your equipment before it gets dark, this will definitely save you time. Okay, tip number 2. Leave as much of your image train and equipment together as you possibly can. When I first started out, I was breaking a lot of things down and putting them back in boxes for some of the individual components. But if you have a place in your house where you can bring in your equipment and leave like your telescope together with your image train all still connected, this can save you a lot of time because you don't have to put those items back together the next time. It also can reduce the amount of fingerprints and dust you get in your image train, and also your flats are important. It's important that your camera's not rotated for flats, and also that you don't have different fingerprints or dust on your image train components. So sometimes if you keep it all together, you might be able to use the same flats from several different, for a few nights in a row if you capture them and none of those items change inside your image train. So that's a suggestion I would have. Tip number 3, use some organizer bins for the equipment you're going to use each imaging session. If you can, separate out the equipment logically into, like, if you put things together in a sequence or you access different things you use during your imaging session in a certain time, organize those together. And that way you're not fumbling around trying to find your equipment or having to go back in where you have the equipment stored. It's right there available for you to use it. And these organizer bins, they're cheap. I mean, you can go to a local department store or a craft store, and they have all kinds of these. You can find some that'll suit your specific needs. So tip number 4, instead of carrying individual bins or boxes or whatever it is out to your imaging site, get a lightweight cart or dolly and stack several of those things on the dolly. And you can take like a bungee strap and strap those onto the dolly so they're not going to fall off easily. And that way, let's say you're carrying 2 or 3 or 4 different boxes or organizer bins out to your imaging site. Just take them all at once on that dolly, and that'll actually save you some time and some of your back of carrying all those different things. Tip number 5 has to do with, some of the setup you go through if you don't have a permanent setup or an observatory is you're setting up your tripod and you're putting your telescope on there and you're balancing it. Well, one of the things you can do is, how your counterweight goes on a shaft or counterweights, and you kind of have an idea usually, about where it goes if your equipment's always the same. But if you have to take that counterweight off or counterweights off to, pack up your equipment each time, and you have to put them back on, why not mark the shaft where the counterweight slides on? And that way you won't have to remember exactly where it goes, and you'll be much closer to having it balanced right when you set it up. You'll still have to balance it, but you'll be much closer to having it balanced right after you set it up. So tip number 6 is related to tip number 5. You also have the other balancing is your telescope as it turns this way, right, on the mount. And another thing you can do is if you're not changing your equipment or your imaging train that often, it's going to be balanced at about the same spot. So why not put a piece of tape or a mark on that Vixen bracket underneath your telescope that goes into the mount saddle, and that way you'll know where that Vixen bracket or whatever style bracket you have lines up with the mount saddle, and you'll be much closer to having it balanced, and it'll just be a real minor adjustment when you go to balance your telescope. Tip number 7 is about your tripod. So if you're using the same spot all the time, another tip you could do is you could mark the ground where the 3 tripod legs go, and you'd want to do this after you have it polar aligned. This way, you're very close. You'll have your tripod position very close for your polar alignment, and it won't be a matter of twisting it very much. This is something that you could do with some tape. It depends on your location and what you have there, if it's concrete or what it is, wood. You could even mark it with some chalk, like some light colored chalk. But I put tape on the ground for this video just to kind of make it real visible. It's just an idea that a person could have their site pre-marked for their tripod, and that way it's going to be very close when they're getting ready to do their polar alignment. So tip number 8 has to do with focusing. You know how we're always having to focus in the beginning of our imaging session, and sometimes throughout it if we're using filters or the conditions are changing. But that initial focus sometimes takes up a little bit of time. And if you have a telescope where the focuser tube extends outside the telescope, you can actually know the measurement of how far is that focuser tube extended when you're in focus. And you could use like an object that you always have with you, or you could use a small tape measure. Or it could be that your telescope has a gauge or markings that give you, what is the setting currently of the focuser. And if you can keep track of what that is, then you know exactly where to go to be very close to in focus. You'll still have to focus, but it'll be very close. Now, if you're using an EAF or electronic automatic focuser like from ZWO, then you also, once your autofocus routine runs, can take note of more or less what is that focuser position. And then if you had to pack up your telescope for some reason, or that position changed after you set up your equipment the next time, then you could actually you can use the option inside the software to go to a specific focuser position, and the EAF will move to that focuser position, and this is going to make your autofocus the first time much more successful. Tip number 9 has to do with your seeing conditions. There are apps, different ones out there. Astrospheric is one. And with these apps, what they do is it's even better than like the weather app, because they'll show you like hour by hour what are the seeing conditions, and that's going to include things like wind, cloud cover, and like the turbulence. It's going to give you some indication of what those conditions are going to be by the hour. So you know your imaging session, let's say, runs from 9 p.m. tonight until 5 a.m. in the morning. This will give you an idea of whether or not that's really going to be a good window to do an imaging session. And if clouds are coming at 3 a.m., why attempt to do imaging during that time? Or maybe they're coming at 1 a.m. and your window is much shorter. This is going to let you plan according to the weather. Now, I usually cross-check Astrospheric against another weather app, just in case. I kind of like to have a second one to look at, because none of them are 100% accurate, but I have found that Astrospheric actually is pretty good, and it seems to be most of the time pretty accurate as far as like especially the conditions you'll get with clouds and turbulence. Tip number 10 has to do with meridian flip. In your mount software, if you're using a go-to mount and you're using ASCOM, then you can actually enable the automatic meridian flip. Of course, a person has to be careful about this with their equipment, and also there's a setting for at what point does it actually do the meridian flip after it reaches the crossing point. And so you could have an issue with, like, your camera or other equipment could actually hit the tripod leg or something like that. So you have to think about those things. But if you're able to set the automatic meridian flip, the reason this is a time saver is when the meridian flip needs to occur, your telescope's going to automatically do it. And that way, your imaging software knows, you could set a setting in that. Usually, like if you're using Nina, there's a global trigger. You set that like at the top of your sequence, and that global trigger is for meridian flip. That way, when the meridian flip occurs, your software automatically knows it needs to reacquire the target. So it'll do another slew and center. And that way, you don't actually run into the scenario where you reach the meridian, your telescope mount doesn't flip, and that's the end of your imaging session, unless you come along and happen to discover, oh, it reached the meridian flip and it didn't automatically flip, and now it's just taking images where they're blurred because the telescope mount can't move, but the target in the sky is still moving. So this is a huge help when it comes to, if you're going to do a target where it's obvious that within the hours you have planned to image that target, it's going to cross the meridian. Tip number 11 to save time is use a program like Stellarium, some planetarium software. And the reason you want to use this type of software is now from your location, you can actually determine if you're going to target, for example, the Andromeda Galaxy, when is that target going to be at a certain elevation in the sky? Because you can actually click on the hour, the date and hour, and you can actually advance it. You can do it just a little bit at a time in increments, or you can actually play it out where it'll start playing and you can watch the target in the sky. This way you know if from your location that target's going to be a good target and it's going to be visible to your equipment in the sky, and also if it's going to be at a good elevation to have good seeing for that target, as well as if it's going to cross the meridian and if it's going to cross the sky and it's going to go below some trees or something else surrounding your site, then this will give you an idea of what's going to happen with that target through the night. And then if you're using something like Stellarium, it supports a custom landscape. And I created a video on this of how to create a custom landscape in Stellarium. If you do that, then because you took a 360-degree photo of the surroundings of your site and you created this custom landscape, when you go into Stellarium, you don't see the default landscape. You can choose your custom landscape, and then you see your true horizon around your imaging site. And that's very helpful because if you're like me and you have trees or other obstacles on, say, the either horizon, then it's going to be very obvious when you try to plan out your imaging session whether or not you're actually going to be able to continue to take images of that target at the timing that you think you are. So the good thing about this is by using that custom landscape, you're going to know if it's going to go below the trees or behind the obstacle that's surrounding your imaging site at what time of day. And that way, if you were trying to, say, plan to image from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. and it's going to be visible all that time, you're good. But if you see, it's going to go behind this obstacle at about 1 or 2 a.m., there's no point to try to image it through 3 or 4 a.m., right? So this is a very good planning tool that can help you save time. Tip number 12 has to do with sequences. So if you're able to leave your equipment out unattended, or you're just going to go check on it, you're going to sleep and you're going to check on it, say every 2 or 3 hours, then if you can plan a sequence of targets, this is going to make the most use of the imaging time that you have available that night. Let's say you have 6 hours or 7 hours. And by planning your targets, let's say you can do 2 or 3 targets. If you can, then in Nina, you can do this in other applications as well, probably SharpCap and others. I don't know about all of them, but you can create a sequence. And so it starts off with, let's say, the Andromeda Galaxy. And then let's say that, after you did several hours of imaging on the Andromeda Galaxy, you also wanted to image another galaxy. You can just add that additional target to your sequence. And then inside that sequence, for each target, you're going to have like the various steps where it does like, changing your filter, auto-focusing, taking many exposures or sub-exposures. And this way you can actually get the most out of your time that night. And by creating a sequence like that, you can actually, if you want to be brave and take the chance, you can leave your equipment out there imaging for several hours. It's automatically, when it finishes the one target, gonna slew and center to the next target, start the guiding again, do the focusing routines, etc., etc. So this is a great way to save time and get more out of your imaging sessions using sequences. Tip number 13. So if you are going to target multiple, let's say galaxies or nebula in the same imaging session, if it's possible to choose targets that you can use the same gain and exposure and offset on, then what the advantage of this is, and how it might save you time, is you're only going to have to create your flats for those settings. Whereas if you choose multiple targets where you can't use the same gain and exposure, now you're having to create flats for the variety of targets with the different settings for gain and exposure and offset that you chose. So it's a personal preference, but it's one way that you can capitalize on your time and make the most out of it by choosing targets with like gain, exposure, and offset settings. Tip number 14 has to do with your darks and your flats. So one thing I used to do is I used to be out at night trying to capture darks and flats. And if you don't have a cooled camera, it's pretty much what you're going to do usually, because the documentation says that the conditions need to be the same, like the temperature, your focus, and your camera orientation all need to stay the same for your flats. Well, if you have a cooled camera, one of the advantages you have, if you don't have to disassemble your image train, bring your telescope in, and you can actually set in your software like Nina or SharpCap or FireCapture, whatever it is, the temperature that you want to cool your camera to. And as long as you didn't disturb your image train, now you can take your flats and your dark flats using that same setup, right? Because you didn't disturb any of those other things, and you can control the temperature of your camera. This is a time saver because at night you want to get the most out of that imaging session and be capturing light frames, right? And then if you can capture those darks, dark flats, and flats during the day while you're doing something else that can run for an hour or two on its own, then you can save that time that you would have spent during the night. And as you know, you're going to be getting out your light panel or putting the end cap on to do your darks or dark flats. So when you're trying to do these other type of calibration frames, that can interrupt your whole night and take up time unnecessarily. So if you have a cooled camera, take advantage of that and do those things during the day. And then step number 15 is, if you have a cooled camera, then why not create a dark library? Those darks are not going to, if you're always shooting, like let's say you use the default 0 Celsius setting for the cooling temperature of your camera, you don't need to worry about retaking those darks. If you're always going to use that same temperature setting, the darks have to do with the sensor in the camera. It doesn't have really anything to do with the rest of the image train, like the primary lens on your telescope, because you're covering that up with the end cap. This is all about your sensor and things like amp glow and things like that. So that's another thing you can do to save time if you can, and you have the space available. Create a dark library, save them in folders, organize them so it's easy to find, like by what exposure time was the dark captured. And also if you have a camera where you're capturing different areas of interest, or you might call it field of view, or like the dimensions of your image, then you also want to know like what sizes they are. And that way, when you can always look them up, you can look in the FITS file, but if you organize them that way, it's quick to find in your dark library the darks that you've already captured, and you don't have to spend time capturing darks again. So in this video, I'm not targeting, again, the expert, seasoned people who've been doing this for a long time. They've already learned all these things. I'm really just trying to help people who are newer to the hobby, and they're still, I don't know, maybe when other people, they learned all these things real fast and they got really efficient, but I feel like I learned some of these things gradually over time and started doing them little by little. And if it can help someone else save time and enjoy the hobby more, that was my goal. So I hope you found this video helpful. And I know that other people are going to have, their own ways they save time and things they've learned that they might want to share with others. Feel free to leave comments if you have other time-saving tips. I'm sure there's going to be someone who's going to say, get an observatory, get a permanent setup for your imaging system, have them appear and all of that, which would be great. But obviously not everyone can do that or has the economic situation or even logistically at their house a place to do an observatory. So I thought this would be helpful to people who, like me, are lugging their equipment in and out every night and having to set up when they're able to do an imaging session, to be able to save a little time and enjoy the hobby a little more. If you enjoy videos like this, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. I try to put out videos, occasionally on different topics like this, as well as on imaging sessions and product reviews. So I'm wishing you clear skies.